All right, so it's 1 o'clock, so we'll officially get started. Greetings, Reyes. I'm thrilled to serve essentially as the introduction to a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Matt Judah, who will be giving this talk. Dr. Matt Judah is a licensed clinical psychologist with expertise in anxiety and mood disorders. He was an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at ODU and is now currently transitioning into an assistant professor position in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Judah completed his PhD in clinical psychology at Oklahoma State University and a pre-doctoral residency at the Medical University of Southern Carolina in 2016. His talk, entitled Don't Panic, Learning to Live with Your Anxiety, will focus on anxiety, its purpose, and understanding the function of anxiety and how we can best cope with it. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to pass the baton over to Dr. Judah.
Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you all today about something that we can all relate to, right? Because anxiety is not one of these issues that only some of us deal with. It's something that all of us deal with. And today I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what anxiety is, what can go wrong with it, what its purpose is, and also ways that you can get a handle on it when things get out of sorts. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about what fear is.
And Matt, I'm just not seeing your presentation. If you're sharing, all I see is gray.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm glad that you did. Are you still only seeing gray?
Yeah, I'm only seeing gray. So maybe if we stop sharing and then maybe I don't know what source you were sharing, but can you share the screen itself?
I'm sharing the screen itself.
Okay.
We did see it briefly.
Are you seeing the screen now?
No, it looks like you're sharing the application. Is there, it might be better just to share the screen itself.
Now we can see it.
Sorry about this.
Yeah, that's just a generic slate. That's not Matt. That's being generated by us.
I see.
So now we got you. Okay.
I think I've got it figured out now.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. Is this better?
Way better.
Okay. Well, I want everybody to see my first slide because there's a subtle Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference there. So, all right. So let's get back to talking about what fear is. And I want you to imagine that you're walking through the woods and you're just kind of walking along, noticing trees in the woods, and suddenly you feel a sensation. Something kind of sticky falls on you, and you look up and you happen to see a hive with honey. And your emotional response in that moment might be to feel happy or to feel glad because, hey, here's honey. I like honey. Honey tastes sweet. And that might be your emotional reaction. But what would happen if you started to notice some bees walking around on the hive? You might experience a sudden shift in your emotions, and your body might suddenly feel very different. Whereas when you just saw the honey, you felt glad and you wanted to approach the honey to maybe get more. Now you feel the exact opposite feeling, which is to get away because you're seeing something that could be dangerous. And the feelings that go along with that might be your heart rate increasing. You notice that you're breathing faster and not as deeply. You might notice your hair standing on end and an urge to get out of there as quickly as you can. And that sensation that you'd be feeling is fear. So fear is an emotion, and it fits broadly within a model of emotion in which some emotions move us toward things that are good for us, And other emotions move us away from things that are bad for us. So in this example, happiness or joy would cause us to want to move more closely toward something in the environment, and fear would cause us to want to move away. And so in this way, fear is helpful. It keeps you away from things that are dangerous, helps you escape and avoid them. Now, fear involves some changes in your body. If you think back to the example we just went through in the woods, you might experience an increase in your heart rate and other changes in the way that your body feels. And part of the purpose of that is that it serves as an alarm. And no alarm is good if it's comfortable. So think about a smoke alarm. If a smoke alarm played your favorite song, then you might ignore it. You might not deal with it. To be effective, an alarm needs to be loud, and it needs to interrupt whatever you're doing and demand your attention. And fear has to work in exactly the same way. It demands your attention immediately so you can't ignore it. And to be able to do that, it needs to be uncomfortable. But in addition to being uncomfortable, the feelings that happen in your body also are due to changes that enable you to be well positioned to survive in an emergency. So I have another example from Star Trek, and hopefully some of you out there like Star Trek. And I want you to imagine what the crew members of the Starship Enterprise are doing on board when the Enterprise is just cruising along through space. What are they doing with their time? Well, they have some duties. Maybe they have to clean up things, they have to sweep, and they have to make sure that engines are in good condition. Maybe when they're off duty, they spend time on the holodeck or hanging out with friends. They're kind of just doing the normal day-to-day routine. And this is what your body does when there is no emergency. And we call that the parasympathetic system that regulates that. And its main job is rest and digest, you could say. Its job is to make sure that muscles and organs are functioning properly. It's trying to conserve calories because food hasn't always been easy to find for our ancestors. And it's just doing business as usual. But when there's an emergency, it wouldn't be good for the members of the crew of the Starship Enterprise to keep hanging out on the holodeck. If there's photon torpedoes coming in to hit the ship, it would be really bad if the crew members didn't stop what they were doing and get to their battle stations and get to the bridge. And so this is an illustration of the way that the sympathetic nervous system works. It recruits all of your body's resources and it focuses them on the emergency that's happening right now. And all of those feelings you have in your body are the crew members running to their battle stations. Your heart beating faster is to pump oxygenated blood to your major muscle groups so that you can fight or run away. That's why the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes called the fight or flight system. Your respiration, your breathing can increase and be much faster to try to get oxygen into the body to get to those muscle groups. The blood vessels in your hands and your feet can constrict to try to conserve the oxygenated blood so it goes to your major muscle groups, which are going to be involved in running and fighting. Your fingers and toes aren't so important. And that constriction of the blood vessels in your hands and feet can produce sweatiness or clamminess, coldness in your hands and feet, or like a sensation of tingling or pin pricking. You might experience some gastrointestinal distress because your sympathetic nervous system is signaling your digestive system to slow down. Because if you're being attacked by a bear or something, that is not a good time to have to take a dump. And so all of these changes that are happening in your body are things that have helped our ancestors survive in an encounter. And when we experience anxiety or fear, oftentimes we just focus on how uncomfortable it is, and we don't necessarily understand that all of these changes actually have a purpose. And that purpose is to prepare you for a dangerous situation that has suddenly come up. Now, there is a distinction between fear and anxiety. Oftentimes, these terms are used interchangeably, but in psychology, we think about them as different but related things. So let's go back to the woods again and imagine that as you're walking in the woods, you look down and you happen to see a venomous snake coiled right next to your foot and ready to strike. The emotion you experience would be fear because you are dealing with an immediate danger that is right there. Now, that could be helpful. Maybe your body's response would be enough to help you get away from that venomous snake in time before you're bitten. But it also might be too slow because after all, the danger is right there threatening you. So wouldn't it be nice if your body had a system to anticipate danger ahead of time? And in fact, it does, and we call that anxiety. So anxiety is the process of recognizing cues around you in the environment that signal some possible danger. And then that causes you to be on the lookout for the danger before it's actually there. So instead of walking in the woods and only happening to look down and it's a snake standing right next to it, you might, as you're walking through the woods, have the thought, hey, I see trees and leaves and dead branches on the ground, and that could mean snakes are around. So what that does is it cues my attention to focus and to screen and look for signs of a snake. And that might let me see one even before I'm standing right next to it. And so this is the way that anxiety works. It gives just a little bit of sympathetic arousal to get you ready when you're in a situation where there might be some danger. And this is really important. And it functions in your life on a daily basis. We would be in a lot of trouble without fear and anxiety. So if you think about something as simple as crossing the road or looking both ways before you pull out onto a road in your vehicle, what's happening is that you have memories of something dangerous happening on the road, maybe in your midst, or maybe your mother yelling at you when you were a kid and you started to run out into the road. And those memories involve some sympathetic response as your brain is recognizing a sign of some danger. And that memory gets linked to what you see and hear in that situation, the road, traffic, other vehicles. And so when you see those things and hear those things, it triggers that memory and causes you to suddenly be vigilant and to look out for danger. And that's what leads you to look both ways before you cross the road. And it might not even be something that you have to think about. It just happens automatically. That's the power of anxiety when it's functioning and working for you. But anxiety is not always so helpful. Sometimes it can backfire and cause problems for people. And we call these anxiety disorders when the anxiety gets to be so intense that it's leading to significant impairment in your daily activities, where it's causing you a significant amount of distress that's causing you to avoid things in your life that are important to do. So some anxiety disorders and disorders related to anxiety are PTSD, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. And there are others. There are simple phobias as well, where a person might have a fear of dogs or heights. But I just want to go over these first because people don't always realize the ways in which anxiety is involved in these conditions. So take, for example, a person who is in an automobile accident where they were afraid of losing their life. Maybe they were even injured and had to be hospitalized. After that, they might develop a kind of phobia of the memory of that and decide, you know what, I don't want to drive anymore. Or maybe I just don't want to drive on the highway. Because when I drive on the highway, it brings back all of those feelings and emotions and all of that distress and fear from the accident. So I decide to avoid that. This is what we would call PTSD. And as the person starts to avoid those things that trigger the memory of the bad thing that happened, they start to become really anxious a lot of the time, and they might start having nightmares or intense recollections of the memory that they're trying to avoid. Another condition that can happen is panic disorder. And panic disorder happens when somebody experiences all the symptoms of fear at least once. So that might be your heart racing really fast, sweaty palms, fast breathing, all of that. And it scares them to death. And then after that, they're afraid it will happen again, especially if they don't know why it happened. Sometimes we feel fear and we don't even know why. It just comes out of the blue. And we call that a panic attack. And if afterward you develop a fear that that will happen again, it might lead you to do things like, you know what, I used to go jogging in my neighborhood. I'm not going to go jogging anymore, because when I go jogging, it makes my heart rate increase. And I don't want to feel one of those panic attacks again. And so you stop doing things in your life that you used to do because you're afraid of having a panic attack. That's panic disorder. Social anxiety disorder occurs when a person becomes afraid that other people don't like them and that they're going to reject them, and they just feel like they don't fit in. They want to have relationships with people, but they don't like meeting new people because they're afraid people aren't going to like them. Obsessive compulsive disorder involves having obsessive thoughts that are distressing, and the person tries to engage in doing things to make those thoughts go away. So an example of that could be, maybe people have random thoughts about all kinds of things, but maybe I just have a random thought that, what if I kicked my dog? I don't want to kick my dog, but maybe I just have that random thought. And it scares me because I'm like, God, I don't want to be a kind of person who kicks a dog. What's wrong with me? And so I try to, maybe I say a prayer mentally, like, I'm so sorry, I'm not that kind of person. And that makes me feel better. Well, then the next time, if I have that thought again, what if I kicked a dog? I go back to that behavior of maybe saying a mental prayer or something to undo that thought. And pretty soon that thought is coming up a lot. That thought ends up becoming a sticky thought that comes up again and again about kicking the dog, even though it's something I don't want to do. But the reason it keeps coming back is because it's something that bothers me so much. So these are some examples of how anxiety can get out of hand and start to cause people problems. And when that happens, that's when it's really time to go seek professional help. And so the purpose of today's talk is not going to be to give professional clinical psychology help, but instead to just give you a broad education about the kinds of things that psychologists do to help people understand anxiety and also to learn to get a handle on it. So the first thing is that in any case when anxiety goes wrong, avoidance is always involved. Avoidance is a behavior where you get away from something when it's not actually dangerous, and that leads to a pattern of avoiding it again and again, and that eventually can lead to an anxiety disorder. So let's take, for example, imagining walking through the woods again. I'm going to keep using that one with the snake. And as you're walking along in the woods, you encounter something that you start to think there could be snakes here. And as you're going along, your perception of threat that there could be snakes begins to increase, and you get scared. You start to notice your heart beating really fast. And so what you decide to do is, you know what? I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I'm feeling really hot. I'm going to go back to my car and I'm going to drive home, leave the woods. And when that happens, your distress goes from being really high to suddenly coming back down. And that's experienced as relief. It's kind of like scratching an itch. It feels good. And what happens when you experience that relief is it reinforces leaving the woods. It reinforces the avoidance, because avoiding resulted in something that felt good. And so you want to do it again next time. So the next time you walk in the woods, what happens is before you even get there, maybe you're starting to think about, I want to go on a hike, but last time I got really scared of there being snakes. So your distress starts to increase before you even get into the situation. And right after you get into the situation, you decide, you know what, I'm going to avoid again. And pretty soon you're not even going into the woods at all. You have the thought, I want to go on a hike. Nope. And because the thought of going into the woods increases your distress, it increases your anxiety. You're not even in the woods yet. There's no possibility of snakes. You're in your apartment or something, or at your house. And what you do is you decide, I'm not going to go to the woods, and that brings relief. And now you don't really have an opportunity to go into the woods easily and see that you can go on a hike, not get bitten by a snake, or you get bitten by a snake and you go to the ER and it's not that big of a deal. You don't have that opportunity because you've just decided to avoid it entirely. And now your life has shrunk in a way where you're a person who likes to go hiking, but you're not going hiking anymore. That's a problem. So how can we deal with this? Well, oftentimes what's going on here is that the person who avoids imagines that if they didn't avoid, their distress would just keep going on up and up and up forever and never come to an end. It would just keep going. And so it's that belief that their distress would just keep going that partially motivates them to avoid. But in most circumstances, I would really say all circumstances, as long as there's not actually something dangerous there, and there's no harm that comes to you, what actually happens is over time, your distress starts to curve and then it goes down and it comes down and you feel better. And you feel that relief even though you're still walking in the woods because you're not being bitten by a snake. And this relaxation that is experienced during the perceived threat reduces your feeling that this is a dangerous situation. It sort of teaches you from experience that this isn't so bad and you can handle it. And then the next time you go into the woods, you still have some anxious distress, but it's not quite as high as it was last time, because last time you didn't get bitten by a snake. Or if you did, it ended up being painful, but you lived. And the anxiety comes down more quickly this time. And it builds a new memory of walking through the woods and having a good time and not feeling as distressed. And as you do this again and again, you start to train your body and recalibrate your anxiety alarm so that it knows that you can go on a walk in the woods. You don't have to avoid it. So this is the basis of what clinical psychologists call exposure therapy, where we take something that a person is afraid of, as long as it's not actually dangerous, and we allow them to experience it. So if a person has a fear of spiders, we can have them maybe start by looking at pictures of spiders, and then maybe eventually handling spiders that aren't going to be dangerous to them, so that they can start to experience that relief without running away. And that's powerful. And it can totally change the way that you feel in a situation. We can do this with virtual reality with people who have height phobias, or maybe people who develop a phobia of driving on the highway or crossing a tall bridge. For a person who has panic disorder, we can simulate panic attacks by having them run in place and jump up and down during a psychotherapy session, spinning around in a chair, breathing through a straw, to produce those feelings of anxiety without anything bad actually happening. And gradually over time, they start to learn that the feelings of a panic attack are uncomfortable, but they're not actually going to hurt you. Now, anxiety also involves thoughts. It's not all about the feelings in your body. And the main type of thought that we talk about, or that we think about in anxiety, is worry. Worry, you could call the language of anxiety. It's the thoughts. It's the what if something happens? What if I go to give this talk and nobody shows up, or nobody likes it, or my slides, I accidentally share my screen wrong, something like that. You think about all the what ifs that could go wrong, but not in a way that's constructive, not in a way that is problem solving. Instead, it's just sort of on a spin cycle. Like imagine your dryer on a spin cycle, but there's no hot air. It's just spinning. It's working really hard, but it's not drying the clothes. That's what worry is like. And so in anticipation of some unexpected threat, what happens if you experience an unexpected threat? So say you're driving on the highway and somebody cuts in front of you, your distress is going to go way up, and that's going to be really uncomfortable. And thinking about that possibility of that happening, it's like, yikes, I don't want to be driving along the highway and not see it coming, because suddenly my distress will go from here all the way up to here, and that's scary. So what a person might do is they use worry to sort of increase their baseline level of distress, so that if an unexpected bad thing happens, if there's some unexpected threat, their distress doesn't increase as much. It's a way this dramatic change in your stress. And this is really unhealthy. This is the basis for something we call generalized anxiety disorder. Because what happens is day to day, you spend your life worrying a whole lot, and that just increases your sympathetic arousal kind of all the time when there's not actually something bad to expect. And what's better is to actually have the experience that you can go through life with a low level of distress, a low level of anxious arousal. And then if something bad happens, you will experience a strong shift, but you'll live through it and you'll be okay, and your body's supposed to work like that. There are a couple of processes that we think about in psychology that are mechanisms of anxiety disorders. And what I mean by this is these are traits that if people have them a lot, they might be at increased risk for an anxiety disorder. Because we all have anxiety, but for some of us, it's gonna start to be a problem. One of those things that predicts whether or not anxiety could develop into a problem is something called intolerance of uncertainty. And this is when a person just really cannot stand not knowing something about the future. So as an example, if you imagine that, let's say you imagine that you have a friend who's supposed to text you, but you don't get that text. And so you start to worry, well, what if they were in a car accident? What if they fell in a hole? What if something really bad happened? And maybe they're in the emergency room and they're something is really bad. So what you do is you check in on them to see if they're okay. And they're like, yeah, I'm fine, I just got busy. And over time, it starts to be kind of an annoyance. So this is an example of intolerance of uncertainty and the way in which it can start to get in the way of your life. Another mechanism of anxiety disorders is something called anxiety sensitivity. And what anxiety sensitivity is it's when you are afraid of the bodily sensations of anxiety or the thoughts related to anxiety. So when I start to notice my mind is racing, thinking about some upcoming test, that scares me. The test was scary enough, but now I'm just scared about my mind racing. I'm scared about my heart beating really fast. I'm scared about feeling this throbbing sensation in my throat. What is that? Why does my stomach feel so weird? That's anxiety sensitivity. When people are scared of the feelings of fear and anxiety, when they don't know that they have a purpose, and that purpose is to help you avoid danger, that ends up leading to problems because you're more likely to avoid things that are not dangerous, like going to a party and seeing some friends and meeting some new people, or giving a talk, or going on a walk in the woods. You stop avoiding things that are pretty safe because you're scared of the sensations you experience in those situations. Some of my research has examined some of these mechanisms of anxiety disorders. And I'm not going to get into the details too much, but I want to tell you just a little bit about it. In one study, we presented people with images, snapshots of their heart rate signal, or snapshots of just white noise. And you can see that in this image here. And then we looked at which image they paid more attention to. And we found that individuals with high levels of social anxiety, because that's what we were looking at in this study, individuals with high levels of social anxiety paid more attention to the images of the heart rate. In another study, we looked at brain activity while people were doing this task. And we told them during part of the task that their heart rate was speeding up. And when their heart rate sped up, when we told them that their heart rate sped up, it actually hadn't. But we looked at their brain activity. And what we found is that looking at the brain signature that indicates attention to your heartbeats, we found this increase in that brain activity that was correlated with social anxiety. Again, social anxiety is what I study in a lot of my research, but I think this would likely be true for other anxiety disorders too. So we can see that evidence of anxiety sensitivity, that evidence that individuals with anxiety problems tend to pay more attention to signs and feelings of anxiety, such as increased heart rate. Now I want to talk just a bit about what you can do to handle anxiety, how you can deal with it. First, the main purpose of this talk has been to be educational, to give you information. Because when you understand that anxiety is normal and that it's there to be helpful, it makes it much less scary. And it can reduce your anxiety sensitivity. Because you can know, you know what, my heart's beating really fast, but You know, it's supposed to be that way. It's like a smoke alarm. It's got to be loud and annoying and distressful. Secondly, if you notice that you worry a lot, where you are thinking about the future, but it's stuff that you can't actually do anything about, instead shift over to problem solving. Problem solving is different because it focuses on the things that you can change, the things that you can actually do. So I might need to go on a road trip where I need to drive somewhere, and I might worry about having an accident. What if I have an accident? What if I have an accident? Well, you know what? That's not going to stop me from having an accident. Instead, what I can do is make sure that I'm driving a pretty safe vehicle. I can make sure that I'm wearing my seatbelt. I can make sure that I have tires with good tread on my vehicle so that I'm best prepared to deal with the situation, and then I just go. That's problem solving. Problem solving is looking at the things you can actually do to prevent dangerous situations, and then you do them. Okay, and so if you focus your energy on problem solving and on actually doing those things, your worry will naturally come down and you'll actually be safer. Worry does not make you safer. Problem solving does. The third thing that you can do is acceptance or mindfulness. And I'm not going to talk about mindfulness too much, but basically it is a practice of being aware of what's going on around you right now in a way that's non-judgmental. So you don't necessarily label things as good or bad, you're just aware of them. So if I notice my heart is beating really fast, instead of having the thought, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me? I might just observe, this is interesting, my heart rate is increasing. I'm not really sure why, but I'm noticing that and I'm okay with it. I accept that this is a thing that my body does. Some other things that you can do to deal with anxiety is use emotion regulation strategies. There are different types of emotion regulation strategies, and some of them are helpful, and some of them are actually not helpful. I want to talk to you about the ones that are helpful today. So there are things that you can do to change your behavior to deal with anxiety. One of them is progressive relaxation. Progressive relaxation is a practice of moving through the muscles in your body, and you simply contract the muscle group, so such as your hands, you contract it, and you don't do it as hard as you can, you just do it pretty hard, and you hold it for a series of seconds, and you feel that tension. You really focus your attention on that feeling of those muscles, and then you just release. And you pay attention to the feeling of relaxation as those muscles relax. This is not relaxing, by the way, that's contracting the muscles that extend my fingers, right? So this is relaxing, just letting it sit. And you can do that with different muscles in your body, and people oftentimes will work in 15 or 20 minutes, moving sequentially down the muscles of their body. It's a good technique for relaxing before falling asleep if you have trouble worrying in bed, for instance. Deep breathing is another practice. So because anxiety involves a change in your respiration, you know, you can't change your heart rate with your mind. You can't think, slow down, heart rate, slow down. But what you can change is your breathing. And because heart rate and respiration are so closely linked, by changing your breathing, you will also change your heart rate. Pretty cool. It takes some seconds. It takes 30 seconds to a couple of minutes, depending on how anxious you are. But what you do is you slow down your breathing, and you especially slow down the exhalation when you're breathing out. So it might look like this. I try to make sure that when I breathe, I'm letting in plenty of air. I don't need to force it in. I don't need to go. That's not what I'm talking about with deep breathing. Instead, you're letting the air come in and really focusing on filling your lungs. When you fill your lungs, you'll notice that your belly comes out. That's deep breathing. And if you want to learn more about it, you can probably watch some videos online or work with a therapist who can teach you this skill. There are also cognitive strategies, that is, strategies that affect the way you think. One of them is reappraisal. Reappraisal is where you look at a situation and you balance out the information. You take into consideration all of the information and you think about it in a different way. So for example, if I saw these people laughing, and I might think, oh, they're laughing at me. I don't fit in. I'm not cool. I'm so anxious. Those could be some thoughts that I would have in that situation. And it all came from how I appraised the situation. Now, let's take the same situation. I'm not changing anything else except the way that I think about it. Instead of thinking they're laughing at me, I'm thinking they're laughing. That's objective. I don't know what they're laughing at. I can meet these people if I don't already know them, or I could go up and talk to them. Instead of thinking I'm not cool, I do my own thing. I do what's important to me. Instead of thinking I'm so anxious and thinking that's bad or there's something wrong with me, instead thinking anxiety is normal. If you go to a party and you meet new people, or you're not, it's not people you're comfortable around, you're going to feel anxious. So that's only to be expected. That kind of reappraisal can help with tolerating anxiety and also with reducing it. It's all in how, it can be all in how you think about it. And reappraisal is not about trying to lie to yourself and pretend that things are better than they are. Instead, it's about correcting the bias of anxiety. And anxiety is biased. Anxiety is pinpointed to notice negative signs of threat, okay? When you're walking through the woods, it's looking for snakes. It's not looking for flowers. It's not looking for honey. Anxiety is not focused on that. It is going to want to put your attention on the negative stuff. And reappraisal is a process of recognizing, okay, I've got this automatic anxiety alarm that's looking out for threats. How do I balance that out? By intentionally thinking about the good things in the situation that I'm in and noticing them too. Another technique you can use when all else fails is distraction. Distraction is pretty easy. Distraction is a strategy where you think of something that demands your attention more, that will grab your attention better, and you focus on that. So as an example, sometimes people lie in bed and they worry, oh, what if I can't go to sleep? It's midnight already and I haven't slept any sleep and I got to get up at 5 tomorrow. And what if, and they start to go through this worry process. Excuse me. They start to go through this worry process that makes them more and more anxious. Well, they could use a distraction strategy where they close their eyes, of course, because they're trying to sleep, and they just focus on things that they enjoy doing. So me, I like to fence. I'm kind of a nerd. I'm into sword fighting, and so I might imagine that I'm fencing, and that's something that's enjoyable for me. Or I could imagine that I'm playing basketball, and I imagine, you know, that I'm scoring points. I'm imagining myself shooting and all of that. That's something that I enjoy, and you're not going to feel anxious and relaxed at the same time. So if you think of something enjoyable and relaxing, it can distract you, it can hold your attention, and it can keep you from going back to those sticky worry thoughts that keep invading your mind. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this. This was just another study where we looked at brain activity. I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So in addition to these things we've talked about today, if you feel like you might benefit from some help, if you're having some problems with anxiety getting in the way of you living the kind of life you want to live, then you might look online, such as the Psychology Today, Find a Therapist. You can find psychotherapists, particularly those who practice cognitive behavioral therapy, are going to tell you a lot of what you've already heard today, and then help you go through practices. They'll give you homework assignments where you need to actually go out and start to do things to reduce the grip that anxiety has over you. So with that, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for being here, and I really look forward to handling your questions. And by the way, these pictures are some of my students, undergraduate students and graduate students in my research lab. Okay, and that's all I have. Dr. Mecca?
Thank you, Dr. Judah. That was a great talk. So we do have some questions that have been coming in during your presentation. So the first one is from Luis from Mexico. What kind of focus do we have when suffering some kind of phobia? How does the brain and body focus on those fears?
That is a really good question. So your brain can hold in mind a current goal. And part of the way that we're able to do this is with a part of the brain called the frontal lobe, which can control your attention. So if you're sitting in a really boring talk, hopefully this wasn't one of them, one of the ways that you can pay attention to it is by using your frontal lobe. And you can actually use your frontal lobe to tell yourself things such as, this could be on the test. I need to be prepared for that test, and actually stir up some anxiety to get yourself to pay attention to it. And the reason that that works is because when things trigger emotion, that grabs our attention. So if I'm sitting here giving this talk and suddenly I hear one of my kids in the other room scream, that is going to grab my attention. And the reason why is because it just automatically stirs up emotions within me that grab my attention and pull it over there. And there are different mechanisms involved in that in the brain, and it's all pretty complex, and it's exciting stuff that that people are studying. The amygdala is a really important area of the brain for that, not only for fear and anxiety, but also for learning. And another area that's really important in anxiety is the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And those are systems that are just sort of always getting input from vision, getting input from sounds around us. And when they notice something out of the ordinary or something that matches something that triggered emotion in our memory, it just immediately turns on the sympathetic nervous system to deal with it. Great question.
Great. We have another question from Melvin from Fort Washington, Maryland, asking, could the flight or fight system be abused socially or physically?
I'm not sure that I fully understand what is meant in terms of being abused physically, or what was the other one, physically or socially?
Socially. Maybe to some extent trying to understand how the flight or fight system can be used by others.
No, I think this is actually a good point. So we've talked about flight in this talk, right? We've talked about anxiety and fear and getting away and avoiding. But the sympathetic nervous system can also be involved in aggression and in fighting. And it involves reduction in pain sensation, for example. It actually sort of slows down the frontal lobe so that you're behaving in a way that is more reflexive and automatic. That makes you faster, right? So if you're dealing with a danger, you might want to react really fast, and you don't want to stop and think about it twice and hesitate, because that'll slow you down. But the problem with that is sometimes you're in a situation where you need to think. And so I think about some of the things that are happening socially in this country and also just around the world in terms of situations where people find themselves in situations where they perceive danger from another person. And instead of using the frontal lobe to kind of slow down and evaluate it, acting really fast and selecting a fight response, because that is, especially if that's trained into you, then that can be very bad. And so there are things that people can do to actually train that response, so that when you're in situations through role play, for example, you can you can train in a different automatic reaction that leads to a better outcome, right? So I'm having in mind the couple in St. Louis who were lawyers who came outside with guns because of protesters in the street, and they're standing there pointing the guns at people with their finger on the trigger. That is not smart. Somebody could have very easily been shot in that situation, and that is a situation that called for some frontal lobe activity instead of kind of a sympathetic response without questioning it. Great question. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but if it was, if it's not, you can send me an email. Happy to do that.
Okay, well, we have another one. So this one's coming from Morgan from Moseley, Virginia. Would you define a more clinical diagnosis of anxiety, such as anxiety, or maybe could you define a more clinical diagnosis of anxiety, such as anxiety disorder? Do you think this could be something that one could self-diagnose, or should it be saved for a physician?
Yeah, so you can always look at signs and symptoms that you're experiencing. And if you have significant interference in your life, there are things that you want to do or that you used to do that you've stopped doing, especially if those are things that are necessary to move through your life. So for example, I don't say hi to my boss in the morning because I'm scared of him. That would be an example of where it might be helpful to go talk to a therapist. And I would kind of suggest that if in doubt, it would be a good idea to talk to a therapist. In terms of self-diagnosis, when we talk about diagnosis, that word, that's something that professionals who are trained to do diagnosis, they're the ones who can do that. If you were, even me for myself, I'm a clinical psychologist and I know how to make diagnoses, but I would not diagnose myself with an anxiety disorder, and nor could I do so in any way that would really mean anything. And the reason is that I'm not an objective evaluator if I evaluate myself. The symptoms and criteria for anxiety disorders are in a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and currently we're in version 5, that's the DSM-5. That's sort of the code book for what the criteria are for anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are very, very common though. They are the most common type of mental health problem that we have, are anxiety disorders. And that's not surprising. If you think about it, if you have a highly sensitive smoke alarm that goes off even when there's no fire, it is really annoying, but it won't ever burn your house down. It won't ever kill you. And so our anxiety has evolved, our anxiety system has evolved to be more sensitive than it needs to be. Because if you're walking around in the woods and you think you see a cougar, oh, it wasn't a cougar after all, it was just a tree. Well, you live to walk through the woods another day. But if you're walking through the woods and your anxiety doesn't pick up on the cougar and you miss it and it eats you, you're dead. And so because of that, an oversensitive anxiety alarm has evolved, and that's one of the reasons why we have anxiety disorders as such a common thing. And there's nothing really wrong with you when you have an anxiety disorder. It's just about recalibrating and retraining your using experience to retrain the anxiety alarm so that it's going off at the right times.
Almost like calibrating your smoke sensor, so it's right?
Exactly right. So I think a misunderstanding that sometimes people have is, I have an anxiety disorder, that means I'm unusual. No, we all have anxiety. It's just that your anxiety alarm has been tweaked and it's interfering with your life, and it can be retweaked. In clinical psychology, if there's anything we can treat, it's anxiety disorders.
That's a good way of putting it. So that actually serves as a good segue to a question we have from Esteban from Costa Rica. He asked, what are some tools we can use to deal with anxiety when family thinks it's not real, it's all in your head, you have a lot to be grateful, you're exaggerating, etc.?
Yeah, what I would probably suggest that you could do in that situation is appeal to common experience. Everybody has had anxiety before. Everybody has had that feeling. And they can relate to that. And so if you focus on those feelings that you're having and the ways in which it's interfering with you, they may be able to understand it more. So it could be a language thing. Sometimes people feel really uncomfortable with the idea that they or a family member might have a mental disorder. And the reason why could be that they hold stigmatized views about mental disorders, that only crazy people have mental disorders or something like that. The reality is that any of us could develop an anxiety disorder. It could happen to any of us because we all have anxiety. In the same way that any of us can get clogged arteries because we all have arteries, we can all get clogged arteries. So there's nothing different, so to speak, about a person with an anxiety disorder. Instead, it just has to do with the amount of anxiety they're experiencing and the types of situations that trigger it. And so I think what I would probably say is, hey, in these situations, here's what's happening to me. My breathing increases a lot. I feel hot. I feel like something's smothering me. Express those feelings and say, have you ever felt like that before? When did you feel like that? Well, I feel like that in this situation. I feel like that when I think about leaving the house and going to a movie theater. I feel like that when I think about going to the mall. And that can appeal to a person's empathy and help them to understand it better.
Great. We have a question from Kernia, or I apologize if I mispronounced that, from St. Lucia. Does being paranoid have anything to do with anxiety?
That is a really good question. So paranoid is one of those terms, like a lot of terms in psychology, that sort of has an everyday, the way that people use it just in normal life, but also has clinical meanings or more precise scientific meanings. And so when I think about paranoia in terms of the psychological meaning of paranoia, no, it is not really, it is not closely related to anxiety. Now, if you have paranoia, it involves anxiety, but in most cases, anxiety doesn't involve paranoia in the way that we think about it clinically. But when people talk about being paranoid, oftentimes what they mean in everyday language is that a person is worried about everything, or that they're really overly worried about some relationship that they're overthinking. If you worry about something a whole lot, you can start to get inaccurate perception of what that relationship is. So if, for example, a person has a romantic partner and they focus on, hey, I texted them and they didn't respond back. Where were they? Where were they? And they start checking the person's phone or other things. That it might be what we would call paranoid. But really, the way that I would prefer to think about it is you're overly worried and you may not have any reason to be, or maybe you do. I don't know. But I would focus on problem solving instead of worry. And I would really think about what behaviors you're engaging in might be working against you. And if you have somebody in your life who's kind of like that, then it might make sense to direct them toward talking to a mental health professional about it.
Thank you. And I just wanted to build on that as a psychologist myself, a developmentalist. So oftentimes in psychology, there's the everyday language that people use to describe phenomena. And then there's these psychological terms that we've developed as psychologists to try to understand these behaviors. And sometimes they overlap, but other times they don't. And paranoia is a good example of that. And paranoia has a very clinical definition, which doesn't necessarily overlap with the everyday use of paranoia. And I want to emphasize that because oftentimes psychology is sometimes viewed as a science that anyone can just quickly kind of understand because it's everyday experiences. But we've created our own definition and basically understanding of these experiences from this kind of lens. Yeah, but if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so there's psychology is kind of a difficult science in that we're trying to work with what we call constructs, language constructs that describe real realities, but they don't always line up one-to-one. And so what we're doing is we're trying to operationalize those constructs. So there are things like intelligence. What is intelligence? There's not a clear definition in our language for what intelligence is as a quantity that we can measure. But what we can do as psychologists is we can give a definition for what it is, and then we can operationalize that in tests that test that construct that we're trying to get at. And it does make it quite difficult sometimes, but clinically what we think of with paranoia is when a person has bizarre notions about others being out to get them. So it might involve something such as the government is spying on me and they're trying to assassinate me or something like that. That's more the type of thing that we're thinking about when we think about paranoid thoughts. That's a great question, though.
So we have another good question. This is actually, it looks like it's a two-parter. It's from Brian Go from Indonesia. How does the mechanism of the brain trigger fear and anxiety? And what is the difference of those two reactions? How does the mechanism of the brain or spinal cord trigger the sympathetic and parasympathetic reactions? That's the second part.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that is a very good question. And it's kind of a long-winded answer. So I'll just sort of summarize it. There is a combination of communication going from one nerve cell to another, neurons, in different groups of neurons that are specialized to handle certain types of information processing. And then there are also hormones that are involved, and hormones are triggered by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And so it's a combination. Hormones work really well for sending signals to the entire body. Neurons work really well for sending messages very quickly to a very particular target. And in terms of brain mechanisms that are involved, the amygdala is very strongly involved in fear and fear responses, and there's a host of different reflexes as well as changes to the physiology of organs, as I talked about with sympathetic response. With anxiety, the bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis and also the prefrontal cortex, so very front of your brain, that is capable of projecting and imagining yourself in future situations. Those areas are very important in regulating anxiety or in instantiating anxiety. Those are important brain areas. Good question.
So it looks like maybe we have time for one more question. So we have one from Brian Cruz from Puerto Rico. Is imposter syndrome related to a type of anxiety? Also, how can one deal with imposter syndrome?
Yes, so I would categorize imposter syndrome as a type of social anxiety. And imposter syndrome involves looking at details about yourself, something about yourself, and looking at the perceived expectations that you have. So you perceive the people around you, maybe bosses, maybe peers, maybe coworkers, maybe family members. You think that they have certain expectations of you, and you might think that based on them. So for example, if I'm working a new job and everybody else knows all this stuff, I might sort of feel like I need that too. Now, one thing to know is that going to be helpful? It can actually be helpful. It can actually motivate you to pay attention and to try to do better at your job because you're motivated to try to meet those expectations. So in a way, you can actually use that emotion to motivate you in a positive direction for your life. Another thing to recognize is that imposter syndrome is normal. It is incredibly normal. In any situation, you know, in our field, we talk about it a lot and we all experience it. Dr. Mecca, I experience it. I'm getting ready to start a new job and I experience it too. And I've just come to accept it as a friend that is always going to be there. And I also can take a look at the things about myself that I like. I can take a look at my values. What are the things I care about that I'm doing? Well, one thing I care about is anxiety disorders. And what am I doing with it? Well, I'm giving a talk to try to help people understand it better. That makes me feel better about myself and what I'm doing with my career. And so you can look for ways that you can live out and engage in the things that really matter to you, that you care about. And that can help to combat imposter syndrome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Judah, for giving this great talk. I wanted to just let the audience know that we are aware that there are questions that have not been answered. However, what we'll be doing is we'll be reaching out to Dr. Judah after this talk and providing him these questions, and he will provide responses to it, which we will then include in the posting of this recorded session later on the REYES website. So if you have any questions still, feel free to send them through the chat box and we'll send those over to Dr. Judah. And you know, we'll try to put all that together fairly up on the web as soon as we can.